Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Last time we finished up our version of Duluth's Canal Park, and today we're going to be jumping across the freeway and filling in this little strip of land immediately adjacent to it with the Cities Union Station. I wanted to begin just by adding a small amount of the downtown street grid. We're not going to build the whole road network this episode. That's going to be saved for a future video. But I just wanted to get a sense of what the context of the station is going to look like and how much space we're going to have to work with. So for these rails, I'm using the Railway 2 set, which is just, it looks so much better than the vanilla tracks. It's a little bit more complex to work with, but it's really, once if you read the guide, mess around with it a little bit, it's really quite easy to use. So I'm laying out the station track in the area where we're going to have the depot, which is about more or less in the same spot as Duluth's depot. So I wanted to just make a quick little test loop just to make sure all these very long trains could actually fit into this station. And that actually ends up presenting some problems as to how we lay the tracks out for this station, but that's something that we're going to run more into later. So for now, I just wanted to make sure that we could actually get trains coming and going out of this, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how to actually fix this later on. Initially, I wanted to try using these single track versions of the station track, but it really didn't work. The trains would roll in and they would just stop, and for some reason they wouldn't be able to reverse and go back in the other direction. So part of the solution that we're going to end up using is that it is going to be a through station. Initially, I wanted to have it be a totally terminus station where you couldn't have any trains going through. They would stop and then reverse and go back the other direction. So we're going to have to make some compromises in that sense, but it's not too much of a change. Of course, we need to adjust the freeway here because there's a large conflict in between the paths of the rail and the freeway. So I'm just building this gentle S-curve using Network Multi-Tool, just like you find in Duluth. And we're going to worry about the paths of all of these things on the outskirts of town in the future. I'm just not going to worry about those right now because that's not within the area that we're building in this episode. I think one of the hardest things that I always run into when trying to build this kind of station is how these rails kind of branch out to meet up with the station track. I feel like it's pretty hard to get these to look natural. They always either look too straight or too curved, if that makes sense. So that's going to be something I mess around with a lot, both on camera and off of camera. Now, I want to have more control over the train service than you get just from allowing outside connections to come in and arrive at your station, because honestly, the AI that manages that kind of stuff is just not that good. So I'm going to build a little dummy station on the very edge of the map. This one right here is going to represent Minneapolis because it's over to the south. And we're going to have a couple train services coming from this direction. We're going to have a generic Amtrak train coming in, and then we're also going to have a kind of higher speed commuter rail like the one that's currently being planned to go between Minneapolis and Duluth, which I believe is called the Northern Lights Express. It's not in service yet, but it is in the planning stages, kind of modeled off the old North Star line. I'm not too knowledgeable about the details of those lines. I'm going to look more into those once we get to kind of developing the context of these rail lines on the outskirts of the city and in the rural areas. But I will link some information down in the description in case you want to read more about the kind of rail service that Duluth might have or has had in the past, because there's really not much there now, except for one sightseeing train, which is something that I'm going to get to in a bit. First, I wanted to run this rail out over on the other side of the station so that we have a full through station. All these lines can come into the station and then either continue on in the same direction or reversing and going back from where they came. That's going to give us more flexibility to setting up these lines. But before we get to that, I wanted to set up the platforms for this station. I'm using I forget exactly what it's called, but it's a set of American platform networks that you can use adaptive networks to adjust the appearance of. They look so good. I absolutely love this brick platform texture that I'm using here. You can see here in the one on the right. So I'm going to set that up so we have two island platforms and then one side platform up against what is eventually going to be the depot building. So our scenic railroad, or heritage railroad, whatever you want to call it, is going to be named exactly the same as the one in Duluth, which is the North Shore Scenic Railroad. Basically, you can take these trains with older locomotives out along the north shore of Lake Superior, which honestly sounds quite fun. So I'm going to be using this really, really cool looking asset, which I will link down in the description. Apparently this used to run in between Minneapolis and Seattle on the Great Northern Railway, and it just really struck me as the kind of locomotive and train just as a whole that you would want to preserve on this kind of railway. Now I started having problems with this whole single track setup, so I decided to delete everything that I'd done in terms of the train lines and start over and build it from the double track versions of the station track, which doesn't look as good, but it actually functions, as you can see here. So we're going to stick with that. The Duluth Depot building is, I think, best described as unique. I couldn't find anything like it on the workshop. This is about the closest I could get by cramming a few assets together that looked nice individually, but not so nice when I tried to replicate the Duluth Depot. So I decided to go in a slightly different direction, where we have a building that is unique in its own right, but doesn't quite look like the Duluth Depot, while still kind of evoking the general style of architecture. So I decided to go with this asset, which at least originally was a clothing factory. It's called the Indiana Cotton Mill, and I think it just about checks all those boxes that I mentioned. So Duluth Depot apparently mostly functions as a railroad museum these days. There's also, I think this is an art museum or something similar attached over on the right side here. I'm going to do something similar here, just like we did with the library back a couple episodes ago. I'm going to use that same set of buildings to add these nice modern looking additions over on this side and do a little bit of detailing. I didn't really think the glass, these tall glass areas kind of fit in as much, so I'm just going to cover these up with these awesome ivy props. But anyway, those are going to serve as the museum portion of our version of the depot. So we have these side and island platforms. These first two, the side and the first island, are going to be terminus lines, so those are going to be easily accessed from the building. But the last one over here, you have to cross the tracks to get to it, so I'm just going to build a little pedestrian overpass, and we're going to make that functional in a minute. But first I wanted to make sure that all these kind of awkward empty areas were filled in and detailed properly. So with all those gaps and surfaces taken care of, it's time to make this functional and accessible to pedestrians. So I'm going to use this lovely set of Adaptive Networks pedestrian paths to make a little covered path that goes down here next to the depot. And I'm also going to run these same things along the platforms so that people can actually use them. I'm going to run an elevated version up this so that we can get people accessing the island platform without them crossing the track. And then I'm also going to connect up all these little pathways here so that people can take various routes to get to and from the platforms. Off camera, I also ran a small network of paths through the depot that meet up with the entrances out front so that people can take various paths through the depot over to the platforms as well. I'm going to upgrade all of these into invisible paths for obvious reasons, and then do a little bit of detailing to finish up the platforms. I wanted to start bringing this place to life with a little bit of functionality, so I'm going to add an entertainment block in here because I think people are going to come here just to see the depot itself and not necessarily to take a train. Then some people who are unwillingly drafted into the population of Amaranth as they wait for their trains, and then a couple of office and commercial blocks as well. For the museum building, I'm going to add a technology museum. I figured that would be the closest to any kind of railroad museum that you could have here. And I'm also going to adjust all of the building spawn points so that we can have vehicles coming in and out at the appropriate locations along the road. I debated for a while whether I wanted to have this be an open station or to have an enclosed building, but I decided to go with this old-fashioned train shed, which I think looks really cool, and it is from a former train station in Minneapolis. The building's still there. You can go and see that. So I'm just going to have to stretch it out a little bit. It's probably a little bit too wide, as you can see down here. But I think the overall aesthetic is worth that suspension of disbelief. And I think the way the light comes in is really cool. So it might not be the most realistic to have this open train station. It seems like they might have remodeled it at some point to make it into an enclosed building. But I just think it looks so cool that we're just going to go with that. And then other than that, it's really just cleaning up a few details here and there, trying to put up some fences to keep people off the tracks while still allowing it to be accessible by maintenance crews, and just generally plopping down a few things that make it look a bit more interesting. As I was detailing, I did decide that it was, even though we're going to have that little bit of suspension of disbelief as to how wide it is, I did think it was just a little bit too wide even for that. So I decided to squeeze it down a little bit and have this single through track over exposed on the other side, just so we can get that little bit of extra space back. And then I didn't really like the bases of this, so I'm going to have to add these little concrete feet all the way along there. It's kind of a tedious thing to do, so I'm just going to skip past that and then finish up the rest of the detailing around here so that everything is nice and clean and kind of makes sense in the context of these columns. Changing focus over to the front of the depot building, I wanted to have a little pull through for taxis and people getting picked up and dropped off from the station. So I'm going to have this 4-lane road in line with the 2-lane road, so the center driving lanes in the middle are in line with the 2-lane roads. The lane on the right is going to be for people pulling in and out of the station, and then this lane over here I'm just going to fill in with IMT, so we have this island in between the driving lanes and the sidewalk, which I think looks really nice once it's all detailed and filled in. And of course I have to block those off with the traffic manager as well so that people don't start driving through the grass. One little detail that I just had to add, at first I wasn't sure where to put it because it didn't really work with the way the building is laid out, but I figured out that I could put it up here right next to this little viaduct that crosses over the freeway toward the bay. And I thought that was it. I mean, normally you see these signs like right front and center of the station, but again, it just didn't work with this asset. So I figured putting it here would still kind of serve the same function, even though it's not in the kind of classic location. But this asset is so cool, I'll link this down in the description if you're interested in using that. And I'm also going to put a little one right over the entrance just so people know that this is the correct building. There's this kind of goofy parking lot built out over top of the tracks near the depot in Duluth, so I kind of just had to build something like that. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I mean, it's really just a parking lot when you get down to it. But I do have to custom make it totally from scratch because it is elevated out over the tracks, so I can't just use parking lot roads or anything like that. So I'm just going to use some ploppable pavement and some network fences as well, some raisable versions of that. And then I'm going to have these tracks expand out beneath this down here. We're going to have a little kind of maintenance area down there. And then I'm just going to add some supports as well to give it the appearance that it's actually being held up from beneath. I'm using these tunnel blocks by Ronix, which are just really fantastic for doing this kind of thing in PO. Very flexible. The textures hold up even if you squish them down like this or stretch them out. So I'm going to be using those a lot in a lot of different builds, just as kind of basic building blocks for different things. But in this case, I'm just using them as little columns. Then I have to go around and manually plop down all of these parking space decals. The annoying part of that is that none of these actually function because they're elevated. So my two options here are either to go through and add in a bunch of the elevatable parking spots where you can actually have individual parking lots that are raised up above the ground. The normal ones, the vehicles will just kind of sink down and it'll conform to the terrain. But I didn't feel like doing that, so what I end up doing is just going through and pasting down a bunch of cars to make it look like there are people parked here long term. Maybe this would be like a long-term parking lot for people who are taking the train and going down to Minneapolis, or whatever the equivalent of Minneapolis would be, or the Twin Cities would be in the world of Amaranth Bay. Honestly, I don't even know why I'm talking about that because I did all of that off camera because it was just so incredibly boring. Moving on to something a little bit more interesting, this little maintenance area down here, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, so this is kind of just a little throwaway build, just to have something in the background that looks like it sort of belongs here. I'm sure we're going to do plenty of more realistic and accurate railroad builds at some point. I just, like I said, wanted something down here that kind of fits the bill, but I also didn't want to go in and do a whole nother overly detailed build. We'll save that for another episode. One thing that I really had no idea about, but I wanted to include, just because they're so prominent in the aesthetics of this kind of build, are signals. So I just kind of plopped down a few of them at various different junctions. If you have any more information about where these are usually located and how they're arranged, do let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of leave them as is and not worry too much about it. So I didn't want to leave this big ugly gap in between the single point interchange and the depot, so we're going to go ahead and very quickly fill in this small area of land. Starting right here on the other side of the viaduct, we have a giant park and ride parking garage and an office building, which I'm imagining are the headquarters of the Amaranth Bay Agency for Transit, also known as ABAT. They have a little bus barn back here. I'm going to clip an invisible bus depot into it so we can get our buses turning out of here. And I'm just going to very lightly detail up this area to make it fit into the surroundings. So with our bus depot now established, I wanted to create our first official bus line. Or actually, it's the second bus line because we have one that goes down across the bridge and over to that little park we made in the very first episode. But most of the transit we're going to have in downtown is going to be streetcars, of course, because that's one of the main features of this series. But I couldn't really manage to fit a streetcar line into here just because of limitations of assets. I don't really have the write one-way tram roads that could pass by in front of the depot. So I'm just going to do a bus line running along here. Maybe when they reconfigured all of this area along the freeway, because of the freeway, they had to get rid of the streetcar line that would have ran there in prior years. But anyway, they have a bus line now, so that's going to be our bus line running the length of downtown. One feature of Duluth that I think is pretty interesting is they have a significant skyway system, just like they do in Minneapolis. So I wanted to start that here. We're not going to run this all the way around downtown yet, because obviously we don't have many buildings downtown. That's going to change fairly soon. But I wanted to kind of get a feeling for how we're going to build this. So I'm just using this modern skyway asset and running some invisible pedestrian paths through it and connecting them down to ground level so that people can actually, or at least in theory, use them. Of course, we have to have a little bus stop in front of the bus depot as well. And I'm just going to detail up the sidewalk here to make it look a little bit more worn and interesting. To finish off the transit-centered portion of this episode, I'm also going to add a people generator thing here so people can hang out at the bus depot, which everyone loves to do, I'm sure. So to finish off the episode as a whole, we're going to add a row of buildings along the freeway here. This is just kind of a little test run for how we're going to do the downtown. Obviously, as I mentioned before, downtown Duluth is on a pretty significant hill. So that's going to present lots of challenges or opportunities for different kinds of building selection and arrangement. Some weird little parking lots here and there where certain buildings have been torn down and replaced with parking spots. But I just wanted to kind of get a sense of the sort of assets we have and the kind of detailing that we're going to do. But again, this is just a little test run. We're going to have plenty more of that in a future episode. Not next episode, but pretty soon. The very last block here is a sad little empty block. I'm imagining there used to be some beautiful, grand Art Deco skyscraper here that they had to tear down to make this slip lane for the single point interchange. On that cheerful note, this is the end of the Union Station build. I really hope you enjoyed. If you want to check out any of the assets that I mentioned in this episode, they'll be down in the description. Otherwise, I can't wait to see you on the next one.